Buried beneath a relentless blizzard, one trapper's ingenuity would challenge everything the wilderness knew about survival. In the heart of the 1869 snowstorm, a round hut, unlike any other, stood firm. Its walls held secrets that would change the way mountain men faced winter forever. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival and innovation, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this ignite your passion for frontier history, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will uncover even more untold legends from the wilds of the American frontier. The blizzard came early that year, a storm that stretched from horizon to horizon, consuming everything in its path. The wind screamed through the mountains, a howling banshee that rattled trees and tore at the ground. Few would have ventured out into the storm, but for Elias Foster, the trapper who had chosen this isolated spot for his winter camp, it was just another test from the wilderness he knew all too well. He stood outside his round snow hut, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. Despite the snow piling up around him, Elias felt no immediate panic. The hut, a strange and unconventional design he had perfected over many seasons of trapping, had already proven itself. The shape, far from the usual boxy log cabins most men built, was crucial. Its curved walls deflected the wind instead of fighting it. The low roof, topped with a thick layer of insulating snow, kept the cold from seeping in. As the storm raged on, he trusted the structure more than he trusted his own instincts. Inside, the fire crackled gently, its warmth just enough to counter the cold pressing against the walls. The fire was fed by wood Elias had carefully chopped and stacked before the first snow fell, now glowing in the hearth like a faint heartbeat in the middle of the storm. In the corner of the hut, his traps were neatly arranged, ready for the next day's work, but Elias wasn't focused on the fur trade right now. The storm had become his real enemy. He glanced over at the doorway, where a thick piece of rawhide hung, fluttering in the wind's fury. The seals he had made in the walls earlier that fall had held fast. No gaps, no cracks. He could already hear the muffled sound of the wind slamming against the structure, but it didn't feel like it could reach him inside. He felt safe for the first time in days, though he knew the storm could last longer than he anticipated. Survival on the frontier wasn't about hope, it was about preparation. But he wasn't just surviving. Elias was creating. He was building a better life in the heart of one of the most brutal places on earth. Each hour of the storm that passed was a testament to that. His hut was more than a shelter. It was proof that there were ways to endure. The way he had engineered this building wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who would come after him when the bitter winds of winter could break even the most seasoned mountain man. The structure was unconventional, even for the rugged frontier. The round shape seemed to mock the rigidity of traditional log cabins, and the roof was steep, layered with snow that added extra insulation. While most men built cabins that could barely hold against a blizzard, Elias's snow hut had been designed to face it head-on. He had learned early on that in the mountains, the weather was never predictable. That meant you had to outsmart it, or it would kill you. Elias had spent years perfecting his design. It had started as a simple experiment, a way to make something more efficient than the usual log cabins that most trappers used. After observing the constant struggle of these cabins under heavy snowfalls and winds, Elias had made a decision. He would take what nature provided and make something that worked with the land rather than against it. Instead of the typical square, he would use a round design, an ancient concept inspired by the Native American structures he had encountered during his travels. The rounded shape was essential. It was the key to the hut's ability to deflect the fierce winds that often threatened to tear down a traditional cabin. The rounded structure allowed the wind to glide off the sides without ever gaining enough momentum to break through the walls. But there were other components that made the design unique. Most of the snowmen had seen huts like it, but few had realized the potential of layering natural materials to enhance insulation. The hut's walls were thick, layered logs that fit tightly together with no gaps, chinked with a mixture of mud and moss to keep the interior warm. Above, the roof wasn't just a thick wooden structure. It was built to trap and store snow. The snow worked like insulation, compressing over time to create an extra layer of protection against the cold. Elias had also incorporated a central chimney. He had read about the European designs and realized that the efficient smoke systems they employed would be crucial. The chimney didn't just vent smoke, it also helped to evenly distribute heat throughout the room. Inside, the fire was the most important component of survival. Elias had learned how to conserve it, keeping it small and efficient without wasting wood. He watched it now, the flames flickering steadily, barely disturbed by the storm outside. It was this mastery of design, this blending of nature and ingenuity, that would be his legacy. And as the snow continued to fall, Elias couldn't help but feel a small measure of pride. His hut had withstood countless tests. Today it would face one more, and he was confident it would survive. More than that, it would thrive. The storm hadn't let up. In fact, it seemed to be growing more intense as the hours dragged on, the wind howling like a beast in the night. Elias had long since stopped trying to measure the passing hours, each minute blending into the next, the only true marker being the ceaseless roar of the storm outside. Snow continued to pile up against the walls of his round hut, but it was no concern. The structure had been built with such forethought that no amount of snow or wind could threaten it. And yet, as Elias sat on his low wooden stool by the fire, he felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't stay in the hut forever. The storm would eventually pass, and when it did, he would have to resume his work, setting traps, checking lines, and preparing his furs for the spring trade. The winters in these mountains were long, and the fur trade was often the only way to ensure survival. But for now, he found solace in the shelter he had built, a quiet peace that wasn't easily earned. Elias had been working on the hut for nearly 3 seasons. His first attempts had been crude, a simple experiment that left him frustrated more often than satisfied. But after spending years learning the ways of the land, watching the storms, and seeing how the old mountain cabins crumbled under the relentless weight of snow and time, Elias had refined his ideas. The round design was the result of countless trials, and now as the blizzard battered the hut from every side, it stood as the culmination of his labor. The fire crackled quietly, a soft reminder of the comfort his hut provided. Elias leaned back, allowing his mind to wander. His thoughts went back to the many winters spent in the wilds of the Rockies, fighting for survival against the unforgiving terrain. He thought of the traps he'd set, the animals he'd hunted, and the loneliness that often crept into the corners of his thoughts. He'd spent so many years in the mountains that the world beyond them felt like a distant memory, one that belonged to someone else. But even in the depths of the blizzard, Elias felt an unshakable sense of purpose. The storm could not break him. The mountain could not claim him. He had something that few others had, the knowledge and the means to survive, not just by brute strength, but by understanding the land, the weather, and how to adapt to both. His round snow hut was proof of that. It was a fortress against the elements, a testament to what human ingenuity could achieve when paired with a deep respect for the wilderness. As the wind rattled the walls of the hut, Elias closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest. He could hear the storm outside, but he knew deep down that he had already conquered it. His shelter would stand, and so would he. The snow would continue to fall, but this was his home now, and he had made it one that could withstand even the fiercest of blizzards. When Elias awoke the next morning, the storm was still raging. The sky was a pale, unyielding white, and the wind was so fierce that the world beyond his hut was reduced to nothing more than swirling snow and a muffled blur. He rose from his bed, stretched stiff muscles that had been dormant through the night, and moved toward the small window high above the ground. The shutters were securely fastened, but Elias knew he didn't need to open them to understand the magnitude of the storm outside. The snow had already begun to accumulate heavily around the base of the hut, but it was nothing he hadn't anticipated. The design of his round shelter was built to shed snow, its rounded roof preventing the weight of the snow from accumulating in one place, keeping the structure from buckling under the pressure. Even so, Elias knew that the real test was not in how much snow the hut could withstand, but in how it handled the ferocity of the storm itself. He stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his way to the exterior of the hut. The wind slapped his face with a biting sting, but the round walls of his shelter provided a surprising shield. The storm's rage deflected and diffused by the structure's shape. He could see the snow piled up against the base of the hut, but there were no signs of weakness, no cracks in the walls, no bulging or shifting from the weight. It was standing strong, just as he had planned. Elias took a deep breath and looked out over the desolate white expanse. The trees were bent nearly to the ground under the weight of the snow, and the world felt still, as if nature itself had paused. But even in the face of such desolation, Elias felt a surge of pride. This place, this wild, unforgiving land, had no mercy, and yet he had conquered it. The hut wasn't just a refuge from the storm, it was a symbol of his resilience, a constant reminder that no matter how fierce the wilderness, there was always a way to survive. As he moved back inside, Elias felt the warmth of the fire waiting for him. The flames flickered merrily in the hearth, providing a gentle hum of comfort that filled the room. He took off his thick fur coat, his muscles aching from the cold, and sat by the fire to warm his hands. Outside, the storm howled and screamed, but in here, inside his round hut, there was peace. The storm was nothing more than a distant threat, one that couldn't touch him or the shelter he had built. It was in moments like this, as Elias stared into the fire and listened to the howling wind, that he knew he had created something that would last. His round snow hut wasn't just a shelter. It was a statement, a promise to himself that he would endure no matter what. The storm could rage all it wanted, but Elias Foster had built a home that would hold, no matter how fierce the winter. And in the heart of that bitter cold, he was invincible. The storm raged through the night, and by morning, Elias could see that the snow had piled high, burying everything in its path. The wind had died down, but the quiet that followed felt unsettling. He stood at the edge of his round snow hut, surveying the landscape, a pure expanse of white stretching endlessly in every direction. In the silence, he could hear his own breath, steady and sure, cutting through the cold air. The fire inside was still crackling, its warmth a welcome contrast to the icy world outside. Elias turned back toward the doorway and headed inside, shedding his heavy fur coat and setting down his pack. He needed to check his traps. The season was far from over, and the fur trade awaited. Yet something lingered at the back of his mind. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was amiss, as if the storm had shifted something in the land itself. The forest was eerily still, and the tracks around the hut, the fresh prints of some creature, set him on edge. Elias had spent enough time in the mountains to know that nature was always in motion, even when it seemed still. He'd lived through bear attacks, encounters with hostile trappers, and countless hardships, but something about this morning felt different. He grabbed his rifle, loaded it carefully, and stepped outside once more. The tracks near his hut were unmistakable, large, wide paws that could only belong to a mountain lion. The prints were fresh, barely an hour old. Elias had never known a mountain lion to come this close to a man's shelter. But then again, he'd never been in a storm like this either. The beast must have been driven by hunger or perhaps desperation. Whatever the reason, Elias knew that a mountain lion so near was dangerous. As he followed the tracks deeper into the woods, Elias moved with caution, the familiar crunch of his boots in the snow the only sound. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he had no choice but to investigate. His round hut wasn't just a home, it was a lifeline. Any threat to it had to be dealt with swiftly. The tracks led him to a small grove of pine trees, where the lion had stopped, perhaps searching for shelter of its own. But Elias didn't find the creature. Instead, he came upon something far more troubling, a set of human footprints, faint and staggered, leading away from the woods and into the direction of the nearby creek. A trapper, or worse, someone who meant him harm. Elias felt his pulse quicken as he crouched down to study the prints. There was no question now, he wasn't alone. A stranger was out here in the storm, possibly injured, and that meant only one thing. Elias had to act fast. He turned, his mind racing with possibilities. The snow was deep, and the storm had made travel difficult, but the tracks were there, clear as day. Elias wasn't sure what kind of man he might encounter, whether he was a friend, a foe, or someone who had lost his way in the wilderness, but he knew that finding out was now a matter of survival. Elias moved swiftly, his footsteps following the faint trail left by the stranger. The storm had not let up, but the snow beneath his boots was solid, offering some resistance as he trudged onward. His rifle was held tight in his hands, ready for whatever he might encounter. He knew that out here it was every man for himself. Trust was a luxury one couldn't afford. The tracks grew fainter the farther he went, the deeper the snow became, but Elias was accustomed to such challenges. His legs ached, the cold creeping in, but he pressed on. His mind wandered back to the tracks he had found earlier, the mountain lion's prints, a reminder of how vulnerable one could be in the wilderness. The storm had altered the landscape, forcing predators and men alike to move into unfamiliar territory. His thoughts were interrupted as he neared the creek. The path had grown narrower here, with dense brush and scattered boulders making the going slower. The prints he was following began to disappear beneath the fresh snowfall, leaving only a vague outline of where the man, or whoever had come this way, had gone. He paused, scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was no sound but the wind, the occasional rustling of branches in the trees, and the deep, muffled crunch of his boots in the snow. He was getting closer. As Elias reached the edge of the creek, the landscape opened up slightly. The trees parted, offering a rare moment of visibility. He stopped to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the area. And there, by the water, he saw it. A figure, hunched and moving slowly. The stranger was a man, a trapper by the looks of his tattered clothes, but he was struggling. Elias could see that the man was bleeding. Blood stained the snow beneath him. The stranger's movements were sluggish, and his posture indicated exhaustion. He was on the edge of collapse. Elias hesitated, weighing his options. He had a rifle and could easily put an end to the threat if it came to that. But the man was injured. The world, Elias knew, had always been one of survival, yes, but there were still lines that could be drawn, lines he wasn't sure he was willing to cross. The decision wasn't easy, but Elias lowered his rifle. The man needed help, and Elias wasn't sure why he felt a sudden compulsion to offer it. Maybe it was the loneliness of the mountains, or perhaps it was the recognition that, despite everything, the wilderness had a way of testing every man, even those as hardened as Elias. With a deep breath, Elias called out to the stranger. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice muffled by the wind. The man turned slowly, and Elias could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, the stranger collapsed, falling into the snow with a muffled grunt. Elias rushed forward, instinct taking over as he dropped to his knees beside the man. This wasn't the wilderness Elias had grown used to. This was something else entirely, something far more human, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in years: compassion. The man's body was limp as Elias hoisted him onto his shoulders, his rifle slung across his back. He was heavier than Elias had anticipated, and his wounded condition made it difficult to maintain a steady pace through the deep snow. But Elias didn't stop. The storm continued to rage, and if the man had any chance of survival, he needed warmth, food, and rest, fast. Elias returned to his round snow hut, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tracks he'd followed were now covered by fresh snow, the landscape seemingly erasing all signs of the stranger's journey. The wind had picked up again, the howl of the storm louder than ever. Elias knew that if he hadn't found the man when he did, the blizzard would have claimed another life. He reached the hut and carefully lowered the man onto the floor, taking a moment to survey his condition. The stranger was still unconscious, his face pale and covered in frost. The blood on his clothes was already beginning to freeze, and Elias could see that the wound was serious, likely a gash from a sharp object or animal claw. He needed to tend to it immediately. Elias grabbed his medical supplies, his hands moving quickly as he worked. He'd seen his share of injuries over the years, everything from broken bones to animal bites. But this one was different. There was something about the stranger's vulnerability that unnerved Elias. It was as if this man, this unknown figure, represented something Elias had long buried in himself. The need for connection, for human warmth and companionship in a world that had always seemed cold and indifferent. The fire crackled softly in the corner, and Elias worked in the dim light, his movements methodical. He cleaned the wound, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, before wrapping it with a clean cloth. He then covered the man with a thick blanket and let him rest. For now, there was nothing more he could do but wait. As Elias sat back, watching the stranger's shallow breathing, he couldn't help but wonder who this man was, and how he had ended up so far out in the wilderness. He wasn't a local, Elias could tell by his tattered clothing and the look of someone who had been on the move for too long. A few hours passed before the man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked several times, as if struggling to make sense of his surroundings. Elias remained silent, giving him space to regain his bearings. The stranger's eyes locked onto Elias's, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You saved my life," the man rasped, his voice weak but filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Elias simply nodded, standing up from where he had been kneeling. "You don't need to thank me. You've got a lot of life left to live. I'm just getting you back on your feet." The stranger looked around, his brow furrowing as he tried to process his surroundings. "This place, it's something else. I've never seen anything like it. Who built this?" Elias smiled faintly. "I did. It's not much, but it'll hold up, keep you safe from this storm." The stranger nodded, then winced in pain as he shifted. "I've been out here too long. The storm, it got the best of me. I wasn't sure I'd make it." Elias understood. It wasn't uncommon for men to get caught in storms like this one, especially in the mountains, where the weather could change without warning. The difference, however, was that Elias had built a home that could withstand the worst of it, and now he was sharing it with a stranger. "Tell me your name," Elias asked, breaking the silence. The stranger hesitated, as if unsure whether to trust Elias. Finally he spoke. William Marshall." Elias nodded again, the name familiar to him. Marshall was a trapper, like Elias, though not one he had crossed paths with before. In a way, the recognition brought a sense of comfort, a fleeting reminder that in the vastness of the wilderness, everyone's fate was still intertwined. The storm howled outside, a constant reminder of the fury nature could unleash upon the mountains. Inside the round hut, however, the fire burned brightly, its warmth filling the room with a comforting glow. Elias sat across from William Marshall, his back resting against the wall, watching the stranger closely as he recovered. William had regained some of his strength after a few hours of rest, and though his wounds were still tender, he was able to sit up. His once thin body had gained a little color, and the fever that had been burning in his eyes seemed to have subsided. Yet he still looked exhausted, as if the weight of the wilderness had taken its toll on him in ways Elias couldn't fully understand. For the first time in a long while, Elias found himself talking to another man, something he hadn't done in months. It was strange, almost unsettling, but it felt natural in its own way. The isolation of the mountains was always a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought a sense of peace and solitude that Elias craved. On the other, it left him yearning for something more. "Where are you from?" Elias asked, breaking the silence. William seemed to ponder the question for a moment before answering. "I was living near the headwaters of the Missouri River, trapping mostly, but things got tough, and I had to move on. Figured I'd head south, find work." Elias listened intently, but the truth was he wasn't that interested in William's past. What mattered now was that he was here, in this cabin, and for the first time in a long while, Elias had someone to share his world with, even if only for a short while. "You're lucky I found you," Elias said softly. "That storm could have taken you, and the mountains aren't kind to anyone who doesn't respect them." William nodded in agreement, his eyes flickering to the fire. "I learned that the hard way. Too many men think they can conquer the land. It's not about conquering, it's about surviving." Elias sat up a little straighter. The words resonated deeply with him. He had always thought of survival as an art, something that took patience, ingenuity, and humility. It wasn't about force, but about understanding. "You're right," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "Survival is about knowing when to fight and when to yield." The fire crackled between them, a shared warmth that seemed to connect their experiences, their struggles. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a sense of camaraderie with this stranger, someone who understood the cost of living in the wilderness. As the storm continued to rage outside, the two men sat in quiet understanding, the fire between them providing more than warmth. It was a bond forged in the heart of the wilderness, one that could withstand even the most violent of storms. The night passed quietly, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. The snow had accumulated even more by morning, and Elias could tell the storm had grown in intensity. It wasn't just snow now, it was an unrelenting blizzard, the kind that made the world outside unrecognizable. The sky was a slate of gray, and the wind seemed to bite through everything, even the thick walls of his round hut. Elias had always found a certain kind of peace in these storms, a sense of knowing that, for all the chaos around him, he had built something strong enough to withstand it. But today, as the snow piled up against the door, Elias felt a rising unease. The storm wasn't just fierce, it was unpredictable. He'd seen plenty of storms come and go, but something in the air told him this one might last longer than the others. Inside the hut, William stirred. He had been sleeping deeply, the warmth from the fire and Elias's care helping to ease the worst of his wounds. His fever had broken, but the exhaustion still clung to him. As he awoke, his eyes scanned the room, landing on Elias. "Morning," William muttered, his voice rough from both the storm and the strain of his injuries. "Morning," Elias replied, standing to stoke the fire. He added more wood to the hearth, the flames leaping higher in response. "How are you feeling?" William grimaced as he sat up, carefully testing his sore muscles. "Better than I was," he said, rubbing his temples, "but still a long way from good." Elias nodded, not surprised. The man had been through a lot, and it would take time for him to recover. "You should stay inside today. No reason to go out in this mess." William was silent for a moment, his eyes watching the swirling snow outside the window. "I'm not sure I can afford to stay here long," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I need to keep moving, find shelter, gather supplies, or else I'll end up worse off than I was." Elias paused, setting the fire poker down. He knew the wilderness was unforgiving, but he also knew the stubbornness that came with men like William, trappers who refused to acknowledge their limits until it was too late. Still, he could see the man's resolve, even in his weakened state. He wouldn't stay idle for long. "You're not in a position to travel right now," Elias said firmly. "The storm's not going anywhere, and you're not going to get far in this." He gestured toward the blizzard outside. "We'll survive the storm first, then we'll figure out what comes next." William looked at Elias, then nodded slowly, accepting the advice, even if it didn't sit well with him. "You're right. I guess I don't have much choice." Elias gave him a small smile, one of those rare moments of camaraderie that had been missing from his life for so long. The storm outside continued to rage, but in the warmth of the hut, Elias felt the comforting sense of connection that only shared survival could bring. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Elias and William spent their time inside the hut, the storm howling relentlessly outside. They had enough supplies to last for a while: dried meat, some salted fish, and the last of the winter potatoes Elias had stored before the storm arrived. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them both alive for the time being. William's condition improved steadily, though it was slow. The fever was gone, and his energy was beginning to return, but the wound on his side still pained him. Elias kept it clean, tending to it as best as he could. The fire was their constant companion, crackling through the days and nights. The world outside had turned into a blur of white, and the storm seemed to trap them in a cocoon of sorts, a waiting game. But each passing day, Elias grew more uneasy. The snow was thick, and the wind didn't seem to show signs of letting up. By the 5th day, Elias began to feel the walls of the hut close in around him. He was used to solitude, but the constant storm, the isolation, and the feeling of being trapped, all of it was beginning to wear on him. Even the fire that had once been a source of comfort felt like it was mocking him now, reminding him of his inability to change the course of nature. William noticed the shift in Elias's mood. He had been quiet the past few days, but he could tell his companion was struggling with something deeper. "You're getting restless," William observed, his voice calm, as if he had been waiting for the moment when Elias would show his cracks. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you?" Elias glanced up from where he was tending the fire, his brow furrowing slightly. "A while. Too long, probably." William didn't push the subject further, but he could see the weight Elias carried. He had known solitude in the mountains, but this kind of silence was different. It felt as though Elias was waiting for something, perhaps for the storm to stop, or perhaps for the loneliness to break. "I've been thinking," William began slowly, "about what you said the other day, about survival." Elias turned toward him, curious. "What about it?" William hesitated. "It's not just about the storm or the cold. It's about us too. About how we live with this land, not just survive it." Elias considered this, the firelight flickering across his face. "That's the truth," he said after a long pause. "The wilderness doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you're strong or clever. It only cares if you're able to adapt, to understand what's in front of you, and work with it, not against it." The storm continued to rage outside, but in that moment there was a quiet understanding between the two men. For all the hardship and all the struggle, they both knew that surviving in the wilderness wasn't just about enduring. It was about knowing when to adapt, when to accept the forces around you, and when to wait. And in the heart of that storm, with nothing but the warmth of the fire and the company of a stranger, Elias realized that the storm had done more than test their shelter. It had tested them both, forcing them to reckon with the reality of living in this unforgiving world. And in the end, it was that realization of human connection and shared struggle that would be their salvation. The storm finally began to ease by the end of the week, its ferocity slowly subsiding into a steady, relentless snow that blanketed the landscape. Elias and William sat near the fire, the heat of the flames casting long shadows across the walls of the hut. Despite the calm, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as if the storm had changed the very nature of the land itself. It wasn't just the weather, it was the weight of everything they had endured together, the quiet, growing sense that the storm had exposed more than just their surroundings. For days now, the two men had spent their time in silence, only broken by the occasional exchange about the storm, the food, and the condition of William's wound. But even that had shifted. The wound was healing, and William was gaining strength, his fever now a distant memory. Yet Elias could sense the change in his own spirit. The isolation wasn't as comforting as it once had been. It had taken him days to admit it, but the storm had made him confront something deeper, the long road of solitude he had walked for years, the self-imposed distance he had kept from others. He had built his hut not just to survive the wilderness, but to survive himself, his grief, his loss, his past. Yet now, with the storm passing and the stranger in his midst, he found himself facing the very thing he had tried to avoid, the connection to another human being. It wasn't something Elias was accustomed to. He had lived so long without it that it almost felt like a foreign language. But over the past few days, as they sat in the warmth of the fire and shared stories of their lives, Elias felt a stirring within him, a stirring that was both uncomfortable and oddly comforting. He glanced over at William, who was staring into the fire, the same deep contemplation etched on his face. The crackling of the logs filled the silence between them, and for a long while neither spoke. William had been quiet lately, but Elias knew he was processing his own thoughts, the same kind of solitary reflection that had become second nature for both of them in this harsh land. Finally, William spoke, his voice low but clear. "It's funny," he said, not looking up from the fire, "how much time we spend out here thinking we're alone, but we never really are we?" Elias raised an eyebrow, his thoughts momentarily interrupted. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" William hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "We think we're in this wilderness by ourselves, but we're really never alone, not really. The land, the storm, the animals, they're all a part of us, whether we like it or not." Elias stared at the fire, considering the words. He had always thought of the wilderness as something to conquer or escape. But William was right. The mountains, the snow, the wind, they were all as much a part of his survival as his rifle, his traps, or his hut. And yet, he had always kept them at arm's length, never truly allowing himself to understand them as he had now, in the midst of the storm. "Yeah," Elias muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose you're right." William turned his gaze to him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's easy to think you're isolated when you're out here, but the truth is, the wilderness is always with you, and sometimes it's the quiet moments like this that teach you the most." Elias felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, in that quiet exchange, they had reached an understanding. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about coexisting with the land, learning from it, and accepting that sometimes the storm was as much a part of you as the man you were becoming. As the fire crackled, Elias felt the weight of the past few days settle in his chest. He had come here for solitude, for escape, but what he had found instead was something deeper, a moment of reflection, a moment of connection. The days following the storm were quieter, almost deceptively so. The wind no longer howled, and the snow had slowed to a soft, steady fall that blanketed the world in a blanket of white. The air had a stillness to it that felt almost unnatural. Elias and William spent the days checking the traps they had set before the storm, though their progress was slow. The cold had set in hard, and the snow had accumulated so thick that they had to work twice as hard to move through it. Elias had noticed that the stranger, now fully recovered and able to walk, had grown restless. It wasn't just the stillness of the storm that bothered him. It was the unspoken tension between them, the looming decision of what would happen once the snow cleared. Elias had never been one for plans, but the uncertainty of the situation seemed to weigh on them both. William had been quiet the past day, lost in thought, staring into the distance as he worked, almost as if waiting for something to happen. Elias had spent hours thinking the same thing. The storm had tested them both in ways they hadn't expected, forcing them to confront their own vulnerabilities and the rawness of the land around them. But now the storm was passing, and with it, The shelter Elias had so carefully constructed seemed too small for what lay ahead. That evening, as the fire crackled and the wind shifted outside, William turned to Elias and spoke quietly. "I can't stay here forever, you know." Elias didn't look up from the fire. He had been expecting this. "No, I figured." "I'm not sure where to go from here," William continued, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I can't keep depending on you. You've done more than enough for me already." Elias took a slow breath, letting the weight of William's words settle over him. He had known this moment was coming, the moment when the stranger, no longer a stranger, would have to leave. "You're right," Elias said, after a long pause. "I didn't expect you to stay. The wilderness doesn't work that way. We move on, we adapt. That's how it works." William nodded, his gaze far off. "It's not just about surviving out here, though. It's about living. And I think you've figured out that balance better than most." Elias looked up at William, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. For the first time, the weight of his isolation, his past, and the storm that had brought them together seemed to ease, if only for a moment. "I don't know if I've figured anything out," Elias said, his voice softer than usual. "But I do know one thing. We survive together. No man, no matter how strong, can make it alone out here forever." William gave a quiet laugh, a soft chuckle. "Guess we'll see if that's true." The fire flickered. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall. But Elias knew that no matter what came next, the bond forged in the storm would remain. For now, though, the decision was made. They would leave this place, this refuge, and return to the wilderness, where survival was never guaranteed, but living was. The morning after their conversation, the sun finally broke through the heavy clouds that had shrouded the mountains for days. The storm had passed, leaving the world covered in a pristine layer of snow. Elias stood by the door of his round snow hut, staring out into the vast white wilderness. The wind had died down, leaving the landscape eerily silent. It was a silence that felt both peaceful and unsettling, as if the world was holding its breath. William stood next to him, his gear packed and slung over his shoulder. He had gathered his belongings the night before, his movements deliberate and slow. The cabin, which had been a temporary refuge, now felt like an anchor, holding him to a place he knew he couldn't stay. Elias hadn't said much that morning. He had packed his own things, his rifle, traps, a few provisions. But there was no urgency. There was something about the moment that felt final, as if both men knew this part of their journey together was over. It wasn't about the storm or the snow or even the struggles of survival. It was about the realization that their paths had diverged. It was time to move on. "Ready?" Elias asked, his voice steady, but laced with an emotion he didn't quite understand. William nodded, his gaze lingering on the fire that still burned softly in the hearth. "I think so," he said, his tone tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know where I'll go from here, but I can't stay." Elias looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll find your way. You're not the first man to travel through these mountains. But take your time. The wilderness has a way of teaching you patience." William smiled, though it was a sad smile. "Patience is one thing I've learned out here. Guess I've got more to learn, though." Elias didn't answer immediately. He had his own thoughts, his own realizations to contend with. The storm, the shared silence, the days spent together, they had made something shift in him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about accepting that survival didn't mean isolation. Perhaps for the first time, Elias felt the sting of human connection. "I'll be fine," William said, his voice breaking the silence. "But thank you for everything. I won't forget what you did for me." Elias gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You don't have to thank me. This is what we do out here. We survive, and we help where we can." William didn't reply right away. Instead, he moved to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping outside. The air was crisp and clean, the cold biting but not unbearable. Elias followed, his steps slow, as he took in the landscape one last time. The world seemed to stretch on forever. The mountains, the trees, the snow, it was all familiar to Elias, but for some reason it didn't feel the same anymore. Maybe it was because the wilderness had just taught him something that no one else could. The cold was still there, the danger, the isolation, but so was the possibility of connection, of camaraderie. "Good luck, Elias," William called over his shoulder, already walking into the snow. "You too, William," Elias replied, his voice quieter than he intended. As William disappeared into the snowy expanse, Elias stood there for a long moment, watching his form slowly fade into the distance. The hut, the fire, the warmth, they all felt distant now, almost like a dream. But Elias knew one thing for certain: this chapter was over, and what came next, well, that was up to him. The silence settled around Elias as he stood alone in the doorway of his hut, watching the last trace of William disappear into the snowstorm. He could feel the weight of the wilderness bearing down on him, the solitude that had always been his constant companion now taking on a new, deeper meaning. For so long, Elias had believed that isolation was the key to survival in this unforgiving land. But now, after everything he had shared with William, the quiet of the mountains seemed heavier than it ever had before. He stepped back into the hut, the warmth from the fire, a welcome contrast to the cold air outside. The crackling of the flames filled the space, but it did little to chase away the feeling of emptiness that lingered in the corners. Elias knew it wasn't just the cabin that felt empty, it was something inside him, something he hadn't realized he had been missing until now. The storm had passed, but the sense of being trapped remained. The storm had made him confront his past, his need for solitude, and his inability to truly connect with others. And yet now, with the silence pressing in on him, Elias felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in years. The need for human connection, something he had denied for so long, was now impossible to ignore. But there was no turning back. William had gone, and Elias was once again left to face the wilderness alone. The decision to survive, to endure, was still his. But now, for the first time, he understood that survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about balance, about accepting the quiet moments, but also knowing when to open up, when to trust someone enough to let them in. Elias grabbed his rifle and headed for the door, the weight of the weapon familiar in his hands. He would continue his journey. The wilderness was still his home, still his refuge. But it wasn't all there was. There was more to life than just surviving. He had learned that from William. Outside, the world was still a blanket of white, the wind picking up again as the storm began to shift direction. Elias adjusted his coat and stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath his boots. It was time to move on, to face the unknown once again. But this time, as he moved away from the hut and into the wilderness, Elias felt a quiet strength within him. He wasn't just running from the storm, from the loneliness. He was running toward something, toward the future, toward whatever came next. The wild was still out there, waiting for him. And he would meet it head-on with the knowledge that survival was about more than just isolation. It was about living, and living, for the first time in a long while, felt possible. The cold had a way of gnawing at a man's spirit, wearing him down little by little until the will to push forward began to fade. Elias could feel it creeping up on him as he moved through the wilderness, the weight of his solitude pressing harder with every step. The snow was deeper than he had anticipated, the wind cutting through the trees in cruel gusts that froze his breath in the air before he could exhale. The world was endless white, the landscape stretching out before him with no markers, no landmarks, just the biting chill and the endless expanse of snow. His footsteps were slow but deliberate as he trudged forward, the tracks he left behind already beginning to fill with snow. He had learned long ago that in the mountains, nothing lasted forever. Not even the traces of a man's presence. It was the kind of place that demanded respect, a place that erases the evidence of human existence as quickly as it appeared. For a moment Elias stopped and looked around. The silence of the snow-covered world was absolute, the only sound his breath and the soft crunch of his boots in the snow. It was easy to lose yourself in this kind of landscape, to let the isolation pull you under. But today, there was something different. Something in the air felt like a promise. A faint flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. It was barely perceptible at first, just a small blur in the white expanse, but it was enough to stir something inside him. Elias's heart rate quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears as he took a cautious step toward the movement. His hand instinctively went to his rifle, but he stopped himself. The movement was too fluid, too deliberate to be a predator. He crept closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the form in the distance. It was a figure, a person, walking with a slow, deliberate pace through the snow. Elias's mind raced. Could it be someone else? Another traveler lost in the wilderness, like William? Or had he finally begun to imagine things, his isolation twisting his mind? The figure drew closer, and as the distance closed, Elias saw that it was a woman. She was dressed in a heavy fur coat, a scarf wrapped around her face, and she moved with the sure-footedness of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating these harsh lands. Elias hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. This wasn't the kind of meeting he was accustomed to in the mountains. He had learned to trust only his instincts, and in the wild, meeting a stranger often meant danger. But something in the woman's posture told him she was no threat. There was a quiet strength in her step, an awareness of the land that Elias recognized. When she saw him, she stopped, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. The snow around them swirled in the wind, but in that moment, everything felt still. "I didn't think I'd find anyone out here," the woman said, her voice clear but tinged with the weariness of the journey. Elias studied her for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I didn't expect to find anyone either." There was a brief silence before she nodded. "I was hoping to find shelter before the storm picks up again. I'm heading toward the next valley to the south." Elias's mind raced, and though he had been alone for so long, a sudden sense of hope flared inside him. The wilderness had brought him a stranger, someone who might offer him something he had nearly forgotten: companionship. "I've got shelter nearby," Elias said, his voice more steady than he expected. "It's not much, but it'll keep you out of the wind." The woman gave him a small, grateful smile. "Lead the way, then." As they walked together through the snow, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't alone. And as the storm began to swirl around them, the promise of a shared fire, of human warmth, seemed like the greatest gift the wilderness could offer. Elias led the woman to his round snow hut, his pace quickening as the wind began to pick up again, howling across the open expanse. The snow, already deep, was falling harder now, driven by the wind into a blinding, swirling mass. Elias's heart beat a little faster as he realized how close they were to being caught in the storm. The woman, though, seemed at ease, her footsteps sure and steady, her presence a calm contrast to the chaos of the weather. When they reached the hut, Elias opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. She hesitated only for a moment before ducking inside, her gaze immediately taking in the warmth of the fire. The contrast between the freezing world outside and the comforting glow within seemed to settle something inside her. "Thank you," she said, removing her scarf and shaking out her fur-lined coat. "I wasn't sure I'd make it another mile." Elias nodded, stepping in after her and shutting the door against the wind. "It's dangerous out there. Storms like this can change quickly." The woman gave him a curious glance as she settled down by the fire, holding her hands out toward the warmth. "You seem to know the land well. A lot of men would have kept moving, kept their distance." Elias didn't answer right away. He was still processing the sudden arrival of this woman, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere in the midst of the storm. There was something about her presence that felt familiar, as if he had been expecting her without realizing it. Not everyone out here is hostile, Elias said finally, his tone quiet but firm. The wilderness isn't just about survival, it's about the balance, the way you live with it. She nodded slowly, then glanced over at him. I can tell you're a man who knows that balance. I'm Calla, by the way. Elias studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her tired but determined expression. Elias, he replied, offering a small nod. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the warmth of the hut now a quiet comfort against the raging storm outside. As the storm continued to howl, Elias realized that this simple moment of shared space, of shared survival, had changed something inside him. It wasn't just about weathering the storm, it was about finding something beyond survival. It was about connection. And for the first time in a long while, Elias allowed himself to believe that maybe he wasn't meant to be alone forever. The storm raged outside, but inside the hut, the fire burned steady, casting soft shadows on the walls. Elias and Calla sat across from each other, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. The storm had done more than bring them together. It had given them a chance to stop running, to pause and breathe. Calla spoke first, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. I've been on my own for a long time. It's not easy, not out here. Elias nodded, his gaze steady. He had lived that life for years, but hearing someone else speak the truth made it feel different. Like maybe, just maybe, there was room for more than solitude. I know. Calla looked at him, a slight smile tugging at her lips. But maybe it doesn't have to be like that anymore. Elias met her eyes, a flicker of something new in his chest, a hope he hadn't felt in years. The world outside was harsh, unforgiving, but in that moment, within the safety of the hut, they were two survivors sharing something deeper than just shelter. They shared an understanding and, perhaps for the first time, the promise of something more. The storm began to break, the wind softening, the snow falling slower. Elias stood by the door, looking out over the mountains, a sense of calm settling over him. The wilderness was still vast, still wild, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Calla stood beside him, her gaze following his. We can make it out here, together, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the promise. Elias turned to her, a rare smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. I think we can. Together they would face the wild, not as solitary men and women, but as companions in the struggle to live, to survive, and to build something lasting in a land that tested them both. The future was uncertain, but they were no longer alone. As the first light of dawn broke over the snowy landscape, Elias and Calla stepped outside, ready to face the world together. The mountains loomed ahead, as mighty and unforgiving as ever, but now they weren't so terrifying. For the first time, the horizon felt full of possibility.